Well, my next guest this morning, he's won Emmy and BAFTA awards, but the nature of his work could not be further from the glittering red carpet images those ceremonies conjure up. For more than 50 years, John Pilger's dissenting journalism has been a thorn in the side of governments, corporations and media organisations. In the 1970s, his film about Cambodia brought to global attention for the very first time the horrors of Pol Pot's regime. In the 1990s, John Pilger's undercover work in East Timor exposed shocking abuses by Indonesia. But more recently, with his film Utopia, he's taken aim at the treatment of the indigenous communities in Australia. It was a journey that brought him back to his birthplace, Sydney, which he's been telling me about.
I grew up in Bondi, which is a beach suburb of Sydney, in a small street and in a small house, and everything seemed small then. Sydney was, in those days, a city of tenements, a smoky city, an industrial city. It was, certainly for working people, it was quite a hard city, but for me it had big, vast blue skies and the smell of salt spray coming up from Bondi Beach, up the hill.
But the interest in journalism, did that come from either parent? Where did that come from?
The interest in journalism came from somewhere. I was a paper boy for many years during my childhood, and I loved it. And I used to get into trouble with the newsagent because I would sit on my cart that held all the newspapers and read them. Newspapers represented the world somewhere beyond Australia that only the movies gave me a glimpse of. So journalism was very much mixed up with finding out about the rest of the world. When I went to secondary school, a friend and I started a newspaper in our first year. We were aged 11, 12, helped by his father, and it was called The Messenger. That was my first experience with running a newspaper. Very enjoyable it was too.
Then, of course, like a lot of your generation, John, you went to Europe, didn't you, with some friends? And was it really when you joined Reuters or when you joined The Mirror that you started doing your serious journalism?
Well, I think I probably was doing serious journalism before I left, actually. I left Australia, as you say. I went to Italy for almost a year. Then I went to London and worked on a few places, but Reuters gave me my first break. But they wanted to keep me sitting at a desk for a couple of years, which was reasonable enough, but I wanted to travel. I joined the Daily Mirror as a sort of interim job. I needed a job. I was broke, and I got a job as a sub-editor in the features department of the Daily Mirror, and that began a long and memorable for me career on that newspaper.
Because, of course, that was when The Mirror did lots of very serious investigative work. I mean, you became their chief foreign correspondent and you covered, for instance, numerous wars, including Vietnam. Does that remain a profound memory for you? I mean, do the images you would have witnessed there remain with you up till today?
Yes. I think anybody who's seen carnage in the form of ordinary people suffering and often blown to bits, burned, when you get your first glimpse of what war really is, that is degradation, terrible degradation, shocking degradation, then you wonder how it can be then elevated in some extraordinary propaganda exercise into this heroic idea of warriors fighting each other and handing out medals and politicians pontificating and so on, because it's degradation. So my first experience of war was in the Mekong Delta, where I went during a particularly intense fighting. When I say fighting, basically it was the guerrillas of the National Liberation Front, which the Americans call the Viet Cong, defending areas in the Mekong Delta while they and all the villages around them were pounded from the air. Seeing ground troops, American ground troops, was quite unusual actually, but you did see a great deal of carnage delivered from the air. and that included napalm, fragmentation bombs, and artillery of a kind of World War One type that would simply flatten villages. And so I saw quite a lot during that, and I've certainly never forgotten it.
But as we look at the world at the moment, John, and see what's happening in Crimea, your thoughts on that? And
Well, you know, I made a film a couple of years ago called The War You Don't See, and it was about the role the media plays in propagating wars. And this is the sense of deja vu is with Iraq and Afghanistan is quite something. Well, you go back further than that because it's almost as if the Cold War is back on. You know, here you have basically what was an elected government in the Ukraine, not a very pleasant one at all, and pretty corrupt, but it was an elected government, finally pushed out of power by a bunch of Nazis, and the Russians next door, who were understandably worried about having such a regime next to them, considering their own history with fascism, but particularly worried about the ringing of their country with missiles and the appropriation of the Crimea, which is their only outlet to the Mediterranean. I mean, here you have a classic example of a country moving in the direction of its own national interests. The Russian logic behind promoting a referendum in Crimea, which seemed to me, in terms of law and logic, to be perfectly understandable, none of the complexity of that situation is explained to us in the West, unless we look for it, and we can find it if we look for it. But the general media line is the bad Russian bear and good us. Us is a sort of strange mixture of Anglo-American world. Of course, in talking to Ireland, that doesn't apply to you, but you're still mixed up with it anyway, because unfortunately a lot of the rendition flights and other NATO flights go through Shannon. It's that sense of us and them all over again, instead of understanding a situation and explaining it to readers and to viewers and to listeners so that people can make up their own minds and perhaps take action to avert yet another war.
And yet, I suppose, when people, if you look at something like Crimea, yes, of course, they have voted for their own independence, but they're part of a larger country, Ukraine, which, if had a referendum overall within it, they would not choose to be annexed by Russia.
Well, they're not really part of it. Crimea was given away without asking by Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. He actually tacked it on to the Ukraine. The difference in those days, because the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, there was no referendum. You know, the hypocrisy that runs through our understanding of the world in the West. We dismember Yugoslavia. We carve off Kosovo and say, okay, Serbia, we will bomb you, but Kosovo's okay. That's a complex situation too. But there wasn't any question then of saying that we were invading Kosovo or that we were stealing Kosovo. Russia is protecting itself, whether you like it or not. Countries do have a right to protect themselves. This country has been ringed during the Bush and Obama periods by missiles. If the same was done to a major Western country, especially the United States, well, it just wouldn't happen. There is quite clear in my understanding of the situation a long-term strategy, and all the literature is there, the documentation is there, that the United States wants to dismember the Russian Federation, to get rid of it, and to bring in NATO, as it's done already into many of the former states of the old Soviet Union, and then move on to China. President Obama has a policy called Pivot to China, whereupon the majority of US naval forces will be moved to the Asia-Pacific region by 2020. These are very strategic moves. They follow an historical pattern, an historical logic. And what has happened in Ukraine is part of that.
Is there a danger, though, John, and I say this to you with respect, that your view of every situation or most situations is coloured by your view of the United States and the power they have used or misused or abused, in your opinion, around the world?
No, not every view at all. No, not every view. I think it's impossible to understand the world. I think it's impossible to be a reporter or a broadcaster like you unless you look in the mirror. So easy, isn't it, to talk about bad Russians or demons in various parts of the Middle East and elsewhere. But talking about ourselves, that is, the alliances that claim to represent us, is almost verboten, right across the Western media. And I've always felt that I didn't have a right to analyze critically other parts of the world unless I analyzed my own. And I'm doing it right here in the country I was born in. I do it in Britain, where I've spent much of my life. I do it in the United States, where I've worked. That's my duty, and I believe it should be the duty of journalists. That view is clearly not shared by the propaganda that makes so much of Western media, television especially, unwatchable. And I mean unwatchable because I know when I sit down in front of the television news, let's say the BBC News, I do so wearily thinking I have to monitor it or deconstruct it, but never to be informed by it. But, you know, it's not a negative picture entirely by any means. We have now whistleblowers, such as WikiLeaks, finally being given their due. And what we have now is some extraordinary works of journalism that have changed the landscape, I think, of media completely and for the better, such as WikiLeaks, such as Julian Assange, such as Edward Snowden, such as Chelsea Manning. And this is what journalism has been about, I think, since the printing press, actually, and that is telling people the things that those who wish to control their lives don't want them to know.
You pledge bail, of course, John, to Julian Assange and continue to see him for a while. Are you in touch with him at all now?
Yes, I see him often.
How is he?
He's fine. He's holding up. I'm sure he'd like to be somewhere else, apart from the Ecuadorian embassy. I know he would be. I'd like to be somewhere else. But as he says it with that dark humour of his, it sure beats a maximum security prison in the US.
And in your own personal life, are you a spiritual person? Probably not, are you? I'm thinking to myself. No.
Well, I'm spiritual in that I believe in the spirituality of human beings. I'm always deeply touched and moved by human spirituality. That is the essence of humanity. It's absolutely, I've seen it struggle against the odds and triumph against the odds, and if that's human spirituality, then I'm all for it. If you mean some organized religion, no interest.
Final question, when's the last time you came to Ireland, and any plans to come back here anytime soon?
I'm really keen to come to Ireland again. Okay, here comes the commercial for Ireland. Every time I come to Ireland, I realise the different history. In spite of the attempts by various Irish governments and the rest of it to make Ireland seem, quote, European, unquote, sure it's European, but it has this incredible history of struggle. When you say those too often anodyne sounding words, human rights, they know exactly what you're talking about. When I say they, not everybody, of course, we don't want to romanticize this, but why not? I always like being in Ireland.
Will you be very welcome to come back anytime soon, John? And thanks for speaking to me this morning.
Thank you.